Life after 65 becomes like a cheap photograph. Everything seems to be in place, but the colors fade and the details blur, especially when you're alone. I, Albert Finch, have lived in Monterey Park for almost 40 years, and the last 3 without Ruth. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night and reach for her side of the bed out of habit. My fingers find only a cold sheet, and reality comes crashing down on me again. Our house on Atlantic Boulevard looks almost the same as when we bought it in 1983. It's a single-story house with a small guest house in the yard, which I built with my own hands when Noel, our only grandson, was born. His mother, our daughter Helen, died in childbirth, and our son-in-law Brian couldn't cope with the grief and drank himself to death, crashing his car when the boy was only 5. So Noel basically grew up with us. Every corner of this house is steeped in memories. Here is the kitchen where Ruth baked her famous blueberry pies, and I tried to tease her about her habit of talking to the dough. The living room with the fireplace where we spent winter evenings, while little Noel played with wooden blocks on the carpet. The backyard with the pear tree I planted on the day we moved in. I worked as a building inspector for 35 years. Not the most glamorous profession, but a respected one. People in our town knew that Inspector Finch didn't take bribes and wouldn't pat you on the head for shoddy work. I may not have always been the most pleasant person on the construction site, but my signature on the documents meant something. Thanks to this job, Ruth and I were able to save enough to not worry about the future. Even after I retired 6 years ago, our savings were enough for a comfortable life. Noel grew up to be a quiet and somewhat withdrawn young man. Perhaps the absence of his parents had an impact, although Ruth and I tried to give him everything he needed. He did well in school, graduated from a local college, and got a job in IT support at some company. Nothing spectacular, but a stable job. I always thought he lacked backbone, character. Ruth said I was too hard on the boy, that he was just different, from a new generation that wasn't used to banging its head against walls. Peyton came into his life 3 years ago, just when Ruth passed away. I remember our first meeting. She was slim, with a sharp chin and attentive eyes that seemed to be assessing the value of every item in the house. She worked as an administrator at a dental clinic, and from the very first moment, I realized that for her, this was just a temporary stop on the way to something more lucrative. "Albert, you're such an interesting person," she said then, looking at the photos on the wall. "Noel has told me so much about you. I can really feel a connection between us." Something in her tone seemed false to me, but I chalked it up to my distrust of new people. Besides, Noel looked truly happy for the first time in a long time. After Ruth's death, he often visited me, helped around the house, and sat with me in the evenings. I could see how much he missed his grandmother. We both missed her. They got married quickly, 6 months after meeting. The wedding was modest, in the city park, with a few friends and colleagues. I paid for everything and gave them a trip to Hawaii as a gift. Then the newlyweds rented an apartment in the eastern part of the city. Peyton insisted that they live separately, even though I offered them a place to stay in our house. There was plenty of room. "We need to build our own life, Albert," she explained. "I'm sure you understand." I understood, of course, but after they left, the house seemed even emptier. They came over for lunch on the weekends, and gradually I began to notice how the dynamics of our relationship were changing. Noel looked me in the eye less and less often and checked his phone more often during conversations. And Peyton, well, Peyton changed when she realized I wasn't as rich as she had expected. "I thought building inspectors earned more," she said once when I mentioned that I had set aside money for a new roof. "It was enough for an honest life," I replied, not hiding my irritation. "Of course, Albert, that's not what I meant," she quickly backtracked, but I saw disappointment in her eyes. Gradually, their visits became shorter and less frequent. Noel would call to apologize for missing another dinner, either because of work or because Peyton wasn't feeling well, or because they had promised to visit her parents. I didn't push it. After all, they had their own lives. And then that damn heart attack happened. One April evening, I was working in the garden when suddenly it felt like someone had squeezed my chest with a huge vice. All I remember is falling to my knees among the rows of carrots that Ruth always loved so much and thinking, "Well, old man, it's time for you to go to her." I woke up in the hospital. It turns out a neighbor saw me fall and called an ambulance. The doctors said I was lucky. They got there in time. When I opened my eyes, the first person I saw was Noel. He was sitting next to the bed, pale and frightened. "Grandpa," he whispered, squeezing my hand. "You scared us so much." Peyton stood by the window, her arms crossed over her chest. Her face wore an expression I couldn't quite read at the time, a mixture of concern and calculation. 2 weeks in the hospital gave me plenty of time to think. I lay there, tangled in wires, thinking about home, about Ruth, about what would happen to our property if I didn't pull through this time. The thought that the government could get its hands on everything my wife and I had built over the years was unbearable. And then an idea came to me. When I was discharged, I asked Noel and Peyton to come over for a serious talk. They showed up on Sunday, both wary. I made Ruth's favorite tea and took out a folder with documents. "I've made a decision," I said when we settled in the living room. "I want to transfer the house and car to you, Noel." He choked on his tea and Peyton froze with her cup halfway to her mouth. "Grandpa, but why?" Noel asked. "I'm not getting any younger, boy." This heart attack made me think. If something happens to me, you'll have to deal with inheritance taxes, courts, bureaucracy. This way, it will be easier. The house will go to you, and I can live in the guest house I built myself. Less hassle for everyone. Peyton put down her cup and leaned forward. "That's very generous of you, Albert," she said, her voice softer than it had been at any time in the past year. "But we can't accept such a gift." "Right, dear?" She looked at Noel, and I noticed it. A brief but unmistakable glance. Commanding. Noel hesitated. "Grandpa, are you sure?" "You love this house." "Of course I do," I nodded, "and I'll continue to live in it. It'll just legally be yours. It would have been yours someday anyway, so why not now? And if you need the money, you can always sell it." "Sell it?" Peyton tilted her head slightly. "But where will you live?" "I'll find something smaller," I shrugged. "An old man doesn't need much." At that moment, something changed in Peyton's eyes. A sparkle appeared that I hadn't noticed before. She quickly regained her composure, but I had seen it. Interest. Greed. "We need to think about it," she said. "It's too big a decision." But I knew there was nothing to think about. I was offering them a house worth $600,000 and a car worth $30,000. Who would refuse? A week later, we met at the notary's office. Peyton was dressed particularly elegantly, with a new manicure and hairstyle. Noel looked uncertain, but when I asked if everything was okay, he smiled and said he was just nervous about the paperwork. "I've never owned real estate before," he joked. "It's time to get started," I replied, patting him on the shoulder. The signing took less than an hour. The notary, an elderly woman with glasses on a chain, looked at me with slight confusion when I explained the situation. "Are you sure, Mr. Finch?" she asked quietly when Noel and Peyton went outside for a smoke. "People usually leave gifts like this in their wills." "I trust my grandson," I replied, "and I want to see him enjoy this house while I'm still here." She nodded, but I could see the doubt in her eyes. Perhaps in her years of work, she had seen many stories like mine and knew how they usually ended. When everything was signed, we drove to the house, now their house, to celebrate. I bought some good wine and ordered food from a restaurant. Peyton was more animated than ever, laughing at my every joke and even proposing a toast to the most generous grandfather in the world. Noel seemed more relaxed than he had in the morning, although I noticed him glancing nervously at his wife when she started discussing what furniture they might replace. "I don't think we need that old sofa, dear," she said, stroking the worn leather upholstery of the sofa Ruth and I had bought 30 years ago. "It doesn't fit with my concept for the living room." "But Grandpa loves that sofa," Noel objected without looking at me. "Oh, Albert said he'd move to the guest house." Peyton turned to me with a smile. "There's hardly room for such a monster there, is there?" I took a sip of wine, feeling something tighten inside. It wasn't that I was particularly attached to the sofa, but they were starting to erase me from this house sooner than I had expected. "You decide," I said as casually as I could. "It's your house now." "See, dear?" Peyton stroked Noel's arm. "Albert understands. We need to make this place our own." That night, lying in my bed, my last nights in the bedroom where I had spent most of my life, I remembered Peyton's face, how it changed when she talked about remodeling the house, how she was already mentally arranging her furniture, hanging her paintings, erasing all traces of Ruth and me. The next day, I started moving my things to the guest house. Noel offered to help, but Peyton remembered an important meeting they were supposedly late for. I saw the guilty look in his eyes as they drove away, leaving me with the boxes. "Don't worry, boys," I said. "I'll manage." By evening, I had moved the essentials. The guest house was small, a bedroom, a tiny kitchen, a bathroom, and something like a living room. But it was more than enough for one old man. I was sitting on the porch with a bottle of beer, watching the sunset, when my grandson drove up, alone. "How are you?" he asked, sitting down next to me. "Fine," I replied. "Where's your other half?" "Peyton's staying with her friend. They're discussing interior design." We were silent for a moment. In the twilight, the garden looked particularly peaceful. "You know," I finally said, "your grandmother always said this house would be yours, from the day you first walked through our door." Noel lowered his head. "I know, Grandpa. She would have been happy that you are the owner now." He looked up at me, tears glistening in his eyes. "Really?" "Of course," I nodded. "You're all we had. Our legacy." He hugged me awkwardly, and for a moment I felt like that little boy who used to run to me with scraped knees and ask me to fix his broken toys. "Thank you," he whispered. "But remember," I pulled away and looked him in the eyes. "A house is not just walls and a roof. It's history, our history. Don't let anyone erase it." He nodded, but somehow uncertainly, and I realized it was too late. Peyton had already crossed out our history with her plans. The next day, the transformation began. I woke up to the sound of a drill. Looking out the window, I saw a truck with the logo of a renovation company and several workers unloading materials. Peyton stood in the middle of the lawn with a tablet in her hands, pointing out where to carry things. I went outside, throwing on a jacket. "Good morning," I said. "Starting the renovation?" Peyton turned around, her smile as cold as a January morning. "Oh, Albert. Yes, we decided not to put it off. The house needs updating." "You could have warned me," I remarked. "I would have moved the car." "Don't worry," she waved her hand. "We asked the workers to be careful with our car." The remark was deliberate, I had no doubt about that. Just as I had no doubt that Peyton already considered me surplus to requirements here, a guest who had overstayed his welcome. All day long the house shook with noise. Hammers pounded, saws screeched. Someone was constantly shouting and laughing. I sat in my little house trying to read, but I couldn't concentrate. It was like watching strangers tear your memories apart. Noel arrived in the evening. He looked tired and a little confused. "Sorry about the noise, Grandpa," he said as he entered the cabin. "Peyton wanted to surprise both of us." "The surprise worked," I grunted. He shifted awkwardly from foot to foot. "Listen, I know things aren't going as we planned. But Peyton, she's just very energetic, and she has a vision." "A vision?" I raised an eyebrow. "Of my house without me in it?" "Our house," he corrected gently. "And no, she's not. Listen, she just wants to make it more modern. For us. For the future." "For what future, Noel?" I looked at him intently. "Are you planning on having children?" He lowered his eyes. "We've talked about it. But Peyton thinks we need to get settled first. Create the right environment." "The right environment," I repeated, "without the old junk. And without the old man Grandpa." He looked at me imploringly. "No one wants you to leave. Just give her time. She'll get used to it." But I could see from his face that he didn't believe his own words. Peyton wasn't going to get used to my presence. It became more obvious every day. Moving to the guest house took 3 days. It wasn't that I had a lot of stuff. I'd always believed that a person didn't need mountains of junk to feel alive. But every little thing I packed carried memories. Photo albums, tools, books that Ruth and I had read in the evenings. An old ceramic mug with a chipped handle. Ruth always threatened to throw it away, but I wouldn't let her. A box of letters, real paper letters that we wrote to each other when I was away on business trips. The guest house that I once built for guests and hobbies has now become my only refuge. 36 square meters, enough for one old man, but strange to think that my whole life has shrunk to this space. I arranged the books on the shelves, hung up a few photos, and placed our last photo together on the bedside table, from our anniversary 6 months before her death. She looked so alive in it, with laugh lines around her eyes and gray hair that she never tried to hide. "I've earned every silver hair, Albert," she would say when I suggested she go to the salon. "And I'm going to wear them with pride." The first morning in the guest house was strange. I woke up at dawn as usual, and out of habit headed to the kitchen to make coffee. After a few steps, I realized that the kitchen was now a tiny nook with a mini fridge and an electric hot plate instead of a normal stove. I froze in the middle of the room, feeling like a ghost in my own life. Through the window, I could see the lights come on in the main house. Vague silhouettes moved behind the curtains. Noel and Peyton were starting their day. It was a strange feeling to be so close and yet so cut off from their lives. I put the coffee on the stove and went out onto the porch to breathe in the morning air. It promised to be a warm day. The garden that Ruth and I had cultivated for so many years was full of spring colors. Azaleas and irises were in bloom. I wonder if Peyton will notice how much work has gone into these flower beds. Or will they also be torn down in the process of renovation? I returned to the cottage when the coffee began to hiss, threatening to spill over the edge. Settling into the only chair with my cup, I opened the newspaper, which I continued to subscribe to out of habit, even though Noel constantly teased me about my antiquity and suggested I switch to online news. Around 9 o'clock, the front door of the main house opened, and Noel came out in a suit. He noticed me, waved, and headed for my cottage. "Good morning, Grandpa," he said as he climbed the steps. "How did you sleep in your new place?" "Not bad," I replied, offering him coffee. He declined, glancing at his watch. "I'm already late. I just wanted to make sure you were okay." "Everything's fine," I nodded. "Don't worry about me." "Listen," he shifted from foot to foot, clearly in a hurry but trying to be polite. "More workers are coming today. They're going to replace the windows in the living room. It might be noisy." "I'll survive," I shrugged. "It's not the first renovation in my life. And also," he hesitated, "Peyton wanted to ask if you would mind if we remove some old stuff from the garage. There's a lot of, junk in there." I felt a wave of irritation rise inside me. Junk? My tools? Which I used to build half the furniture in this house? Boxes of Christmas decorations that Ruth collected over the years? Noel's old bike, which I kept in case he ever had children of his own? "Sure," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Go ahead. Just if you find a box labeled a tools, set it aside for me." The relief on his face was so obvious, it was almost painful. "Thanks, Grandpa. I'll keep an eye on it." He gave me a quick hug and hurried to his car. Peyton never came out to say goodbye. The day dragged on slowly. The workers arrived at 10 and actually started replacing the windows. I could hear Peyton bossing them around, her voice sharp and demanding. At times she went out into the garden to talk on the phone, and I heard snippets of her conversations. We'll completely remodel." "Yes, he moved into the guest house." "No, we won't tear it down, at least not yet." That yet stung unpleasantly. It was as if my presence was a temporary inconvenience that had to be endured. By lunchtime, I decided to go for a walk. Sitting within four walls, listening to my former life being dismantled, was unbearable. I walked past the workers, nodded to Peyton, who pretended to be checking something on her phone, and headed for the park 2 blocks from the house. Monterey Park had always been a quiet town. It wasn't the kind of place you'd find in a tourist brochure, but it was cozy and safe. I greeted familiar faces. After 40 years of living here, I knew almost everyone in our neighborhood. Mrs. Chen from the bakery on the corner, who always set aside fresh cinnamon rolls for Ruth. Tom from the hardware store, whose father sold me my first set of tools when we first moved in. Officer Riley, the young police officer, who often stopped by our house to chat while I was working in the garden. "Mr. Finch," he exclaimed when he saw me in the park. "Long time no see. How are you?" "Better than you'd expect at my age," I replied. "I hear your grandson has moved in with you?" He smiled. "That's good news." "Yes," I nodded, without going into details. "He and his wife are living in the house now." "And you?" I hesitated. "In the guest house." "Young people need their space." Riley frowned but said nothing. Perhaps he had seen stories like this before. Old people being pushed out of their own homes for their own good. When I returned home in the evening, I found that the workers had already left. The lights were on in the main house, and through the new windows without curtains, I could see Noel and Peyton having dinner at the table. My table, the table where Ruth and I had eaten for 30 years, where we celebrated birthdays, Christmas, Thanksgiving, where little Noel did his homework and I helped him with math. I decided not to go in. Instead, I heated up some canned soup and sat down to eat alone, listening to the old radio I had brought from home. It crackled and lost the signal, but it was a familiar, comforting sound. Thus began my new phase of life, 30 steps away from my past, but in a completely different world. The following weeks turned into a strange routine. I woke up, made a simple breakfast, read the newspaper, sometimes walked around the neighborhood or met up with old colleagues at a cafe on the main street. Sometimes I would go to the supermarket or the library to pass the time, but I always returned to my little house in the evening, trying not to look at the main house, which with each passing day looked less and less like the place where I had lived most of my life. Peyton had practically stopped talking to me. If we crossed paths in the yard, she would limit herself to a short hello or a nod. Noel still came to see me, but his visits were becoming increasingly rare and awkward. He talked about work, vacation plans, and the new furniture they had ordered. But he never asked how I was feeling in this tiny house, surrounded by other people's decisions and changes. One evening, about a month after I moved in, I heard loud voices coming from the main house. Noel and Peyton were clearly arguing. I didn't want to eavesdrop, but the sound carried through the quiet garden, and individual phrases reached me through the open window. "We can't just... It's his house, too." Noel's voice sounded tense. "It's our house now, Noel," Peyton replied sharply. "He gave it away himself, remember? But not for us to... For us to what? Live in it? Make it comfortable for us? I'm not going to apologize for wanting a normal house. Not a museum of your childhood." There was silence, then a door slammed. A minute later, Peyton rushed out to the backyard, throwing on her jacket as she went. She didn't notice me sitting in the shade on the porch and quickly walked to her car. Another door slammed, the engine roared, and she drove away. I sat motionless, feeling a strange mixture of guilt and anger. On the one hand, I didn't want to be the cause of arguments between Noel and Peyton. On the other hand, I was angry that this house, which I had built with my own hands and in which I had buried so many memories, had now become a battlefield. After a while, the door of the main house opened again, and Noel appeared on the threshold. He stood there for a moment, looking into the darkness of the garden, then headed toward my cottage. I turned on the light to let him know I was awake. "Grandpa," he called, coming closer. "Can I come in?" "Of course," I replied, opening the door. "Would you like some tea?" He nodded and sat down on the only chair in the room. I put the kettle on and sat down on the edge of the bed, watching my grandson. He looked exhausted, dark circles under his eyes, tousled hair, his shirt collar undone. "I'm sorry if we disturbed you," he said without looking up. "Peyton and I had a bit of an argument." "I heard," I admitted. "It's hard not to hear." He sighed. She has a vision. For the house, for our life." "And you?" I asked, pouring tea into cups. "What? Do you have a vision? For your life?" Noel looked at me blankly, as if the question had never occurred to him. I don't know. I like my job. I love Peyton. I want her to be happy. Are you happy?" He was silent for a long time, twirling the cup in his hands. "When we first met, I was happy," he finally said. "She was so bright, so energetic. I felt special around her, like she chose me out of all the men in the world. And now? Now," he paused. "Now it's more complicated. She's always unhappy about something. The house, her job, me. It's as if everything we have isn't good enough." I wanted to tell him that Peyton would never be satisfied, that she was the kind of person who always wanted more. More money, more status, more power, that she was using him, just as she had used me, to get what she wanted. But I couldn't. He had to figure it out for himself. "You know," I said instead, "your grandmother was a difficult person too. Stubborn, strong-willed. We often argued." "Really?" He looked at me in surprise. "You always seemed so harmonious." "Because we learned to respect each other's opinions," I explained, "and because we loved each other more than we wanted to be right." Noel was silent for a long time, staring into his cup. "I don't know what to do, Grandpa," he finally said. "Peyton wants to remove all your things from the garage. He says he wants to turn it into a gym. It's your house now," I reminded him of his own words. "You can do whatever you want with it." "But that's not right," he suddenly raised his voice. "This house, you built it. You and Grandma. Everything in it has meaning." "It has meaning to you," I corrected him gently, "but not to Peyton, and you have to decide what's more important to you, the past or the future with her." He put down his cup and hid his face in his hands. "I can't choose between you." "You don't have to." I put my hand on his shoulder. "I'll always be your grandfather no matter what happens to this house or my things." He lifted his head, tears glistening in his eyes. "I'm sorry, Grandpa. All of this, it wasn't supposed to be this way. Life rarely goes according to plan, boy," I smiled. "The main thing is to stay true to yourself." He left around midnight, somewhat calmer, but still clearly torn by contradictions. I couldn't sleep for a long time that night, thinking about our conversation. Maybe all was not lost. Maybe Noel would begin to see Peyton for who she really was. But the next day I realized my hopes were in vain. Returning from my morning walk, I saw that the contents of the garage had been dumped on the lawn. My tools, old boxes of Christmas decorations, Noel's bike, everything was piled up in a messy heap. Peyton stood nearby, directing two workers who were carrying out the remaining items. "What's going on?" I asked, approaching them. Peyton turned around. There was no trace of embarrassment on her face. "Oh, Albert, we decided to clean out the garage. They're coming today to install the exercise equipment. What about my things?" "You can take whatever you need." She waved her hand toward the pile. "We'll take the rest to the dump." I looked at this mountain of memories thrown away like trash. Tools I had worked with my whole life. Ruth's things, which I had kept because I couldn't bring myself to part with them. Noel's toys, which I had hoped to show his children someday. "Where's Noel?" I asked, trying to sound calm. "At work, of course." Peyton took out her phone and started typing something. "He knows. We discussed everything yesterday after he came back from your place. I doubted that Noel had really agreed to this, but I decided not to argue. Instead, I started sorting through the pile, picking out the things that were most important to me: photo albums, tools, a box of Ruth's letters. I carried them to my cabin, making several trips, while Peyton watched me with poorly concealed impatience. "Are you going to be much longer?" she asked when I returned for another load of things. "The workers need to finish before lunch." "Almost done," I replied, lifting a box of tools. "Just a couple more trips." She rolled her eyes and went back to her phone. I continued sorting through my things, trying to salvage what little could be salvaged from my former life. In the evening, when Noel returned from work, I was waiting for him on the porch of my little house. He got out of the car and headed straight for me, avoiding my gaze. "Grandpa, don't," I interrupted him. "I understand." "Really?" He looked surprised. "Because I don't understand what's going on myself. Peyton said you agreed about the garage, and we didn't agree." I shook my head. "But it doesn't matter. It's your house. Do what you want with it." He sat down next to me and we watched the sunset in silence. The main house looked different now. New windows, fresh paint. The flower beds in front of the entrance had been dug up and replaced with some trendy potted plants. The traces of Ruth in my life were being erased one by one. "I tried to talk to her," Noel said finally, "but she won't listen. She says I'm too attached to the past, that we need to move on." "What do you think?" I asked. He shrugged. "I don't know. Maybe she's right. Maybe you can't live in the past." "There's a difference between living in the past and respecting it," I remarked. "Without the past, there is no future, Noel. It shapes us, makes us who we are." He nodded, but I could see that my words were falling on deaf ears. He had already made his choice, even if he didn't realize it yet. A choice in favor of Peyton and her vision of their life. A life without me and without everything I represented. In the days that followed, the situation only got worse. Peyton completely ignored my existence, and when we did have to interact, she was cold and formal. Noel tried to smooth things over, but even he began to visit me less often. When we did talk, the topics became increasingly superficial. The weather, the news, sports. No mention of the house, of Peyton, of what was happening between us. I could feel the wall between us growing every day. My grandson, the boy I had raised as my own son, was gradually drifting away, drawn into the orbit of Peyton and her ambitions. One Saturday morning, about 2 months after I moved into the guest house, I woke up to the sound of cars pulling up. Looking out the window, I saw several expensive cars parked at the main house. Well-dressed people were getting out of them, carrying gifts and bottles of wine. I got dressed and went out onto the porch. Peyton was greeting the guests at the entrance, beaming in an elegant dress. Noel stood next to her, wearing a suit I had never seen before, clearly expensive and well-tailored. One of the guests noticed me and said something to Peyton. She glanced quickly in my direction, then leaned over to Noel and whispered something in his ear. He nodded and headed toward me while the other guests went inside. "Grandpa," he said, coming closer. "Good morning. Are you having a party?" I asked, nodding toward the house. "Yes," he looked embarrassed. "A housewarming." Peyton wanted to celebrate the end of the renovation. "I see," I nodded. "Why didn't you tell me?" He hesitated, fiddling with a button on his jacket. "I was going to. It just happened so fast." Peyton organized everything in a couple of days. I knew he was lying. Parties like that aren't organized spontaneously. Peyton had planned it in advance and deliberately not invited me. And Noel, well, he chose her side again. "Sure," I said. "Have fun." "You could join us," he suggested uncertainly, and we both knew it was a mere formality. "No thanks." I shook my head. "I have plans for tonight." His shoulders visibly relaxed with relief. "Okay, then, see you later?" "Sure," I smiled, trying not to show how much this situation bothered me. "Go on, don't keep the guests waiting." He nodded and quickly returned to the house. I watched as he took Peyton by the arm, and they greeted another couple of guests together. Young, successful, beautiful, the perfect picture for social media. No hint of an old grandfather living in a shed in the backyard. All day long I heard music, laughter, and the clinking of glasses from the main house. Several times I noticed guests coming out into the garden, glancing curiously at my little house, but no one approached. I sat inside trying to read, but I couldn't concentrate. Every burst of laughter, every toast reminded me that I was no longer part of this life, that to Peyton and now to Noel, I was an unwanted, uncomfortable reminder of a past they were eager to leave behind. The party went on late into the night. I couldn't sleep because of the noise, so I just lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling and thinking about how we had gotten to this point. Where had I gone wrong? What could I have done differently? When the last guest left and the lights went out in the main house, I was still awake. Too many thoughts were swirling around in my head. Too many emotions were churning inside me. Bitterness, disappointment, anger. And somewhere deep down, determination. Determination not to let Peyton completely erase me from this story. Determination to remind them both that every action has consequences. The next morning, I got up early and went for a long walk. I needed to clear my head, gather my thoughts. When I returned, Noel was waiting for me by the cottage. "Grandpa," he said as soon as he saw me, "I wanted to apologize for yesterday. We should have invited you." "Don't worry about it," I replied, walking past him toward the door. "I wouldn't have come anyway." A week had passed since the housewarming, but the tension in the air had only thickened. Noel smiled guiltily when we met, but our conversations became shorter and more meaningless. Peyton completely ignored my existence, walking past me as if I were a garden statue rather than a living person. That day I woke up at dawn as usual. The morning was clear and warm, typical of a California spring. Through the open window came the scent of blooming orange trees and the distant noise of the city waking up. I made myself some coffee on the small stove and went out onto the porch to enjoy the morning silence. The main house was still asleep. The curtains were drawn, and there was no sign of any activity inside. Noel and Peyton were probably sleeping in after a busy week at work. I took a sip of coffee and opened the fresh newspaper, which I still subscribed to out of old habit. Around 9, I decided to walk to the supermarket. The supplies in my tiny refrigerator were running low, and I wanted to cook myself a proper lunch instead of reheating semi-finished products. Besides, walking helped me stay in shape and keep my mind clear. I got dressed, put my wallet in my pocket, and headed for the exit. Passing by the main house, I noticed a shadow flit across the window. Apparently, Peyton or Noel had already gotten up. I wanted to wave but changed my mind. Why impose on people who don't need you? Monterey Park had always been a quiet town, perfect for leisurely walks. I greeted familiar faces, stopped to exchange a few words with Mrs. Chen from the bakery, and stood in front of the bookstore window, looking at the new arrivals. A normal life, a normal Saturday morning. Nothing foreshadowed what was about to happen. At the supermarket, I picked up a basket and slowly moved between the aisles, selecting groceries. Bread, cheese, some fruit, a package of chicken breasts, a bottle of decent wine. The small pleasures of a single person. At the checkout, there was a young couple with a child in front of me. The little boy, about 3 years old, looked at me curiously, then suddenly smiled and waved. I waved back, feeling a lump in my throat. I wonder if Noel will ever have children. Will I see my great-grandchildren? I walked back slowly, enjoying the weather and thinking about the times when Ruth and I used to walk these same streets, holding hands. She always loved spring, saying it was a time for new beginnings. Nothing is final, Albert, she would repeat. There's always a chance to start over. I turned onto our street and noticed unusual activity at the house. There was a large pickup truck with an open bed in front of the driveway, and people were bustling about on the lawn. At first, I thought Peyton had hired gardeners or was renovating again, but the closer I got, the more I realized something was wrong. And then I saw it. My belongings, the few possessions I had left in the guest house, were piled up in a disorderly heap on the lawn. Clothes, books, photo albums, even the mattress from my bed. 2 strong men were carrying the last boxes out of the house, and Peyton was standing nearby, supervising the process. I froze in place, unable to believe my eyes. The grocery bag slipped from my weakened fingers and fell onto the sidewalk. The sound of breaking glass, probably a wine bottle, caught Peyton's attention. She turned and saw me. For a moment, something like embarrassment flashed in her eyes, but it quickly gave way to cold determination. She straightened up and headed toward me. Albert, she said in the tone one usually uses with a disobedient child, we need to talk. I stared at her, still unable to comprehend what was happening. What are you doing with my things? We're clearing out the guest house, she replied, crossing her arms over her chest. We need space for a home office, and the little house is perfect. But I live there. My voice sounded hollow, as if coming from far away. That's exactly what I wanted to talk to you about. Peyton took a step closer. Noel and I think you'd be better off in a nursing home. Or maybe you could rent an apartment somewhere closer to the city center. There are more activities for people your age there. I looked past her at the main house, searching for Noel. Where's my grandson? He's at work, Peyton snapped. He has an important project. He knows about our decision. Your decision? I felt a wave of anger rising inside me. Throwing me out on the street is your joint decision? Don't be dramatic, Albert, she rolled her eyes. No one is throwing you out. We just think it's time for everyone to live their own lives. You gave us the house, remember? Legally, it's ours, and we can do with it as we please. I looked at this woman who was speaking to me with such contempt, with such certainty that she was right, and I couldn't believe that my grandson could have agreed to this. I want to talk to Noel, I said firmly. He's busy, I told you. Peyton took out her phone and looked pointedly at the time. I have a lot to do too. Your things are packed, you can pick them up anytime. We even called you a taxi to the Pine Hill Motel and paid for the first week. Here's the address. She handed me a piece of paper. I didn't take it, continuing to look her in the eye. I'm not going anywhere until I talk to Noel. Something changed in her face. The mask of politeness slipped away, revealing her true self. Listen, old man, she hissed through clenched teeth. We don't need you anymore. Do you understand? This is our house, and we want to live in it without constant reminders of the past. Without you. Noel is too soft to tell you this to your face, so I have to. Pack your things and leave. I took a step back, shaken not so much by her words as by the venom with which they were spoken. Suddenly, everything fell into place. Her fake smile when we first met, her sudden interest in me after my heart attack, her enthusiasm about transferring the house. It had all been part of the plan from the beginning. You planned this, I said. stating a fact rather than asking a question. From the moment I offered to transfer the house. "Oh, for God's sake," she sighed with exaggerated patience. "Not everything in this world revolves around you, Albert. We just want a normal life, without the burden of an old man who needs to be looked after." "I never asked to be looked after," I objected. "I'm completely independent." "For now," she emphasized the word, "but we all know what will happen next. You're getting older, and sooner or later you'll become a burden. We're just anticipating events." I looked at her and saw not a human being, but a predator. Calculating, ruthless, devoid of any empathy. And my grandson, my Noel, was in her clutches. "Let me talk to Noel," I repeated. "On the phone if he's at work." "No," she snapped. "I already told you he knows about our decision and agrees with it. He just doesn't want an unpleasant scene." I didn't believe her. I couldn't believe that the boy I had raised, who had cried on my shoulder when he was in pain, who had laughed with me at silly jokes, could so easily throw me out of his life. "I'm not going anywhere," I said, feeling my resolve grow stronger. "This is my home. I built it with my own hands." "But you gave it to us," Peyton countered. "And by law, we have every right to do with it as we please, including the right to decide who can live here." She nodded toward the pickup truck, where two men stood watching our conversation. "That's Mike and Trevor. They're helping us move. If you don't want to leave voluntarily, we can call the police. What do you think the neighbors will say when they see you being led away in handcuffs?" I knew she was bluffing. The police wouldn't arrest me for standing in front of my former home. But the thought of public humiliation, of neighbors who had known me for decades seeing such a scene, it was unbearable. "Give me half an hour," I finally said. "I'll pack my things." Peyton smiled, but it was the smile of a winner, not of someone feeling relieved. "A wise decision, Albert. The taxi will be here in an hour." I slowly walked around the pile of my belongings scattered across the lawn. Some were already wet with dew, others were crumpled and stained. My life reduced to a pile of junk on someone else's lawn. I started with the most valuable items: photo albums, Ruth's letters, documents. I put them in a suitcase, which fortunately was not badly damaged. Then I gathered my clothes, the ones that could still be saved. Books, most of which were hopelessly ruined by moisture. A few personal items that had sentimental value to me. Peyton watched me from the porch, offering no help and showing no sympathy. Her workers were already bringing new furniture into the guest house. A computer desk, a chair, some shelves, erasing the last traces of my presence. When I was done, I was only able to pack a small portion of my belongings, what would fit in a suitcase, in 2 bags. I had to leave the rest behind. I stood in the middle of the lawn, surrounded by the debris of my life, and felt like a ghost, disembodied, invisible, devoid of any substance. "The taxi is here," Peyton announced without looking up from her phone. Sure enough, a yellow car had pulled up to the curb. The driver, an elderly Latino man, got out and walked toward me. "Mr. Finch?" he asked. "I'll take you to the Pine Hill Motel." I nodded, unable to speak. He helped me load my things into the trunk, glancing puzzled at Peyton, who was still standing on the porch, cold and unapproachable as a statue. "Goodbye, Albert," she said as I got into the car. "Maybe we'll visit you sometime." I didn't answer. I just got into the taxi and closed the door, cutting off her voice, her face, this whole nightmare my life had become. "Where to, sir?" the driver asked, looking at me in the rearview mirror. "Pine Hill," I replied automatically, then shook my head. "No, wait. First to the bank on Garfield Avenue, please." He nodded and started the engine. The car pulled away and I looked back at the house. One last look at the place that had been the center of my universe for almost 40 years. Peyton had already gone inside, but I thought I saw a face flash behind the curtain on the second-floor window. Noel? Was he really at home watching this scene? Or was it just a play of light and shadow, and my heart was simply seeking comfort in illusions? The bank was a 15-minute drive away. The whole way there, I sat staring out the window, but seeing nothing in front of me. My head was in chaos. Fragments of thoughts, memories, plans that would never come to fruition. And somewhere deep inside, beneath layers of shock and pain, a smoldering ember of anger began to glow. "We're here, sir." The driver's voice brought me back to reality. I got out of the car, asking him to wait, and headed for the ATM. I withdrew the maximum amount allowed by the limit, $500. That should be enough for the time being until I decide what to do next. Returning to the taxi, I gave the driver the address of the motel. He nodded silently and drove off. I think he understood that something had happened to me, something bad, but he was tactful enough not to ask any questions. Pine Hill turned out to be a typical roadside motel, a one-story building with a row of doors opening onto the parking lot. Nothing special, but clean and relatively safe. I paid the taxi driver, who helped me carry my things to the front desk. Behind the desk sat a middle-aged, overweight woman with dyed red hair and a tired look in her eyes. "How can I help you?" she asked, looking up from her magazine. "I should have a reservation," I said, "under the name Albert Finch." She flipped through the registration log, then nodded. "Yes, here it is. Room 12, paid for a week in advance. You'll need to fill out a guest card." I filled out the necessary forms, received the key, and headed to my room. It was cool inside and smelled of cheap air freshener. A double bed, a TV, a small table with 2 chairs, a wardrobe, and a bathroom the size of a storage room. I sat on the edge of the bed, still not believing what was happening. Just that morning, I had been in my little house, surrounded by my belongings, making coffee on my stove. And now I was here, in a faceless motel room, with the pitiful remnants of my possessions and no idea what to do next. The first thing I felt was pain, sharp, piercing, as if something inside me had broken. The pain of betrayal, rejection, loss. I have lived a long life, seen the deaths of loved ones, experienced failures and disappointments, but nothing prepared me for the fact that my own grandson, the boy I raised as a son, could so easily erase me from his life. Then came the anger, quiet, cold, calculated. Not a violent outburst of rage, but an icy, controlled fury. Anger at Peyton for her manipulation, at Noel for his weakness, at myself for my blindness and naivety. How could I not have seen that this woman was simply using us both? How could I have so easily given away everything I had, believing in their good intentions? And finally, determination came. I will not be a victim in this story. I will not quietly disappear so as not to interfere with their normal life. I will not meekly accept the role of an unwanted old man who was gotten rid of at the first opportunity. I took a photo of Ruth out of my suitcase and placed it on the bedside table. Her smile, captured on paper many years ago, now seemed especially bright, as if she were trying to support me from afar. "What would you do, Ruth?" I asked quietly, looking at her photo. "What would you say to me now?" And I almost heard her voice, calm and judicious, with that note of steel that always came out when it came to protecting the family. "Fight, Albert, not for the house or the things, for justice. For what is right." I got up and walked over to the window. The sun was already setting, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. A new day would bring new opportunities. But for now, I needed to think, gather my strength, and come up with a plan. I took my wallet out of my pocket and pulled out a small card that I always carried with me. It had the phone number of Jim Elliott, my former colleague from the municipality. We had worked together for many years, and although we had rarely communicated recently, I knew I could count on him. I picked up the motel phone and dialed the number. After a few rings, a familiar voice answered on the other end. "Jim Elliott here." "Jim?" I said, surprised at how calm my voice sounded. "It's Albert Finch." "I need your help, Albert?" His voice sounded surprised. "I haven't heard from you in 100 years. What's going on?" "It's a long story," I replied. "But in short, I've been kicked out of my own house, and I want to find out if there's any way to get it back." There was a pause, then Jim asked in a more serious tone, "Where are you now?" "At the Pine Hill Motel, room 12. "I'll be there in half an hour," he said. "And Albert, hang in there, old man." I hung up and sat back down on the bed. For the first time in this whole nightmare of a day, I felt something like hope. I'm not alone. I have friends, connections, knowledge, and I have experience. The experience of a man who worked in the system for 35 years, studied it from the inside, knows its strengths and weaknesses. Peyton thought she was dealing with a helpless old man who could easily be pushed aside. She didn't know who she was dealing with, and she was about to find out. I opened my suitcase and took out a folder with documents. Copies of all the papers related to the transfer of the house. which I had prudently kept. I laid them out on the table, preparing for Jim's arrival. A plan was already forming in my head. Not revenge. No, I was above that. A plan to restore justice. It was getting dark outside, and the room was quiet. Only the ticking of the clock on the wall broke the silence. I sat in the dim light, looking at Ruth's photo, and felt the shock and pain gradually give way to cold determination. They wanted to get rid of the old man. Well, this old man would show them what he was capable of. Jim Elliott showed up exactly 35 minutes after my call. He knocked on the door 3 times. His signature knock, which I would recognize from 1,000. I opened the door, and we hugged silently. Jim had always been a strong man, but the years had taken their toll on him too. Gray hair, wrinkles around his eyes, a small belly. Nevertheless, his handshake was as firm as it had been 30 years ago. "You look like hell, old man," he said, walking into the room and glancing at my meager belongings. "I feel like hell," I replied, closing the door. Jim sat down on the only chair, and I sat down on the edge of the bed. Between us on the table lay a folder of documents, evidence of my naivety and gullibility. "Tell me," Jim said curtly, and I began. I told him everything from the beginning, how I had a heart attack, how I decided to transfer the house to my grandson, how Peyton gradually distanced Noel from me, and how I ended up thrown out onto the street with the pitiful remains of my possessions. Jim listened silently, sometimes nodding or frowning. When I finished, he sat motionless for a long time, tapping his fingers on the edge of the table. "That's a shitty story, Albert," he finally said. "But you know, I've seen worse. Family. Sometimes they can be more ruthless than any enemy." I nodded, feeling a lump in my throat again. "It's not about the house, Jim. It's about betrayal. My grandson, whom I raised as my own son." "I understand," he raised his hand, stopping me, "but now is not the time for sentimentality. We need to act. Show me your papers." I handed him the folder with the documents. Jim studied them for a long time, occasionally making notes in a small notebook he took out of his jacket pocket. "Okay," he said finally, putting the papers aside. "There's good news and bad news. Which do you want to hear first?" "The bad news," I replied. "As usual. The bad news is that, technically, the house does belong to your grandson and his wife. The deed is in order. All the signatures are there. Legally, they had every right to kick you out." I nodded. Deep down, I knew that from the start. "And the good news?" Jim smiled, and there was something predatory about his smile. "The good news is that some important details were overlooked when the property was transferred. For example, the Land Management Act. I don't see it in your papers." I frowned, trying to remember. "The notary said something about it, but Peyton was rushing me to sign, and I forgot." "Exactly," Jim tapped his finger on the folder. "Without that deed, ownership of the land can be disputed. The house, yes, it's theirs. But the land underneath it, that's something to talk about." I felt a spark of hope ignite inside me. "Do you think I can get it back?" "Hold on," he interrupted. "That's just one lead. We need more. Tell me about the developers in your area. Has anyone shown interest in buying land?" I thought about it. Monterey Park had been actively developing in recent years. Old single-story houses were being torn down to make way for apartment complexes and shopping centers. "Redwood Development," I finally said. "They've been buying up property in our neighborhood for about 2 years. They offered to buy my house, but I refused." "Redwood?" Jim raised his eyebrows. "Interesting. Do you know who the owner is?" "No," I shook my head. "Some big corporation, as far as I understand." "Not exactly," Jim leaned forward. "Redwood is owned by Victor Cohen." "Do you remember him?" I tensed up. Of course I remembered Victor Cohen. 10 years ago, when I was still working as a building inspector, I refused to sign off on one of his buildings due to serious violations of building codes. Cohen tried to bribe me, and when that didn't work, he threatened me. But I had evidence. Photographs, reports, witness statements. In the end, he had to redo the work and pay a large fine. "I remember," I said quietly. "He hates me." "Maybe," Jim shrugged. "But in business, personal feelings take a back seat. If you can offer him something beneficial, he'll listen." "What can I offer him?" I wondered. "I have nothing left." "You have information," Jim tapped his temple with his finger. And possibly leverage. Think, Albert. In 35 years as an inspector, you surely know things about Redwood that others don't. I closed my eyes trying to remember. Cohen's projects I had encountered, documents that had passed through my hands, conversations with workers and subcontractors. Wait, I said suddenly, opening my eyes. The Greenfield project. 3 years ago, shortly before I retired, Cohen was building a residential complex on the site of an old warehouse. There were problems with groundwater, and he used a prohibited method of reinforcing the foundation. Go on, Jim leaned forward. I noticed the violation during the inspection, but one of his engineers convinced me that they would fix everything before the final inspection. I gave them a chance, took their word for it, but then I was transferred to another site, and then I retired. I don't know if they fixed the problem or not. What about the documents? Jim asked. Do you have any evidence? I nodded. I always made copies of important documents and kept them at home. They should be among the things that were left behind. I paused, remembering my things thrown out on the lawn, wet and ruined. But you're not sure if they're still there, Jim finished for me. Not sure, I admitted, but there's something else. The photos. I always took pictures of problem areas. Those pictures should be on the old computer at the municipality. If they haven't deleted my files yet, Jim smiled. I still have access to the archives. I can check tomorrow. Thanks, I said, feeling the tension ease a little. But even if we have this evidence, how will it help me get my house back? Directly it won't, Jim admitted, but it gives us leverage in our negotiations with Cohen. If Redwood is really interested in your neighborhood, we can offer a deal. What kind of deal? You keep quiet about the violations at Greenfield, and Cohen helps you with your house. I thought about it. It smacked of blackmail, and I had always been an honest man, never compromising my conscience. But now it wasn't just about the house. It was about justice, about not letting Peyton and her obedient Noel get away with what they had done. I need to think about it, I finally said. Of course, Jim nodded, but not too long. Time is working against us. He stood up, ready to leave. Tomorrow I'll check the archives for photos and contact the land department about the Land Use Act. You get some rest. You look like you're about to collapse. I walked him to the door. Before leaving, Jim shook my hand firmly. Hang in there, Albert. We'll figure something out. After he left, I sat on my bed for a long time, staring into space. A plan was beginning to take shape, but I was troubled by the moral implications. Using information about violations as leverage, that wasn't what I had taught Noel. It wasn't how I had lived my life. On the other hand, was what they did to me fair? Did I deserve to be thrown out of my own home after everything I had done for my grandson? I looked at Ruth's photo on the nightstand. What would you say, dear? I asked quietly. What would you do? Of course, there was no answer. But somehow I knew that Ruth, for all her kindness and gentleness, would not have sat idly by. She always said, being kind doesn't mean being weak. I went to bed with a heavy heart, but I no longer felt as helpless as I had in the morning. I had a friend, I had a plan, and I had the determination to fight. The morning brought new strength and clarity of thought. I took a shower, shaved, and went down to the small cafe at the motel for breakfast. The food was mediocre, but the hot coffee and toast helped me gather my thoughts. When I returned to my room, I found a note slipped under the door. It was Jim's handwriting. I'll be back at 2. I have news. I had a few hours left, and I decided to use them to organize the few things I had managed to save. I laid out my clothes, arranged my books, and wiped down the photo frames. The process itself was therapeutic. It was as if I were rebuilding pieces of my life after a hurricane. At exactly 2 o'clock, there was a knock at the door. Jim looked excited, which was unusual for his normally unflappable nature. We're in luck, he said, coming in and throwing a folder on the table. I found the photos from the Greenfield project, and they say more than we could have hoped for. I opened the folder. Inside were printed photos of the construction site, the foundation, rebar, groundwork. To a layman, they would mean nothing. But to me, with my experience, they spoke of serious violations of building codes. They never fixed the foundation problem, Jim said, pointing to one of the photos. What's more, they forged the final inspection documents. The signature isn't yours, but it's very similar. I looked closely at the document. Indeed, the signature was a skillful forgery of my own. Good enough to fool most people, but not me. This is forgery, I said, feeling a wave of anger rising inside me. They forged my signature. Exactly, Jim nodded. Do you know what that means? It's a criminal offense. Forgery of official documents, violation of building codes, potential threat to the lives of residents. If this comes to light, Cohen could lose his license, not to mention heavy fines and possible jail time. The next morning, Jim and I met with Victor Cohen at his office. When I walked in and saw him sitting behind a massive dark wood desk, I was overcome with a wave of memories. 10 years ago, this man threatened me, promising that I would regret my principles, and now here I was, seeking his help. Albert Finch, he said, looking up from his papers. I must admit, your call surprised me. Mr. Cohen, I nodded, trying to look calm and confident. Thank you for meeting with me. He pointed to the chairs in front of the desk. Have a seat. I'm told you have a business proposal. I sat down, placing the folder with the documents on my lap. Jim sat down next to me, silent and attentive. You're right, I began. I have a proposal that may interest you. I know about your plans to develop the neighborhood where my former home is located. Cohen raised his eyebrow slightly. Former home? I transferred it to my grandson a few months ago, I explained. But there have been complications. What kind of complications? I briefly told him what had happened, how I had been thrown out of my own home, how I had ended up in a motel with the pitiful remains of my possessions. Cohen listened attentively, his face remaining impassive. A sad story, he said when I finished. But what does it have to do with me and Redwood Development? A great deal, Jim interjected. We discovered that serious legal errors were made in the transfer of the house. Specifically, the land use deed was not properly executed. I opened the folder and took out the documents Jim was referring to. Cohen took them, glanced through them quickly, then looked up at us. And there's this, I continued, taking out the photos of the Greenfield project. Do you remember this project, Mr. Cohen? 3 years ago, problems with the foundation due to groundwater? His face flinched for a moment, but he quickly regained his composure. Listen, Finch, if you came here to blackmail me— Not blackmail, I interrupted him, to offer a mutually beneficial solution. I know you've been buying up real estate in our neighborhood. My former home is one of the last ones you haven't managed to acquire. Cohen leaned back in his chair, studying me intently. Let's say that's true. What are you proposing? I can help you get that house, I said. And not just that one. I have information that the owner of the neighboring lot, Harris, is also willing to sell. He's unhappy with the changes in the neighborhood and is looking for a buyer. These two lots together will give you the perfect site for part of your project. Interesting, Cohen leaned forward. And how exactly can you help me? Thanks to errors in the documentation, I have grounds to contest the deed to the house. With Jim's help, who still has connections in the municipality, we can initiate a review of the transaction, and there's a good chance the court will declare it invalid. What about Greenfield? Cohen asked bluntly. Are you threatening me with these photos? No, I shook my head. I'm offering a trade. You help me get my house back through legal means, and I'll forget everything I know about the violations at Greenfield. What's more, when the house is mine again, I'll sell it to you at a reasonable price, along with the narrow strip of land behind my fence that provides access to the utilities along the creek. Cohen looked at me with a long, appraising gaze. I could see the calculations flashing in his eyes. He was weighing the risks and benefits, figuring out whether he could trust me, whether it was worth the effort. Why don't you just sell me the rights to contest the deed? He finally asked. Why all this complicated plan? Because it's not just about the house, I replied honestly. It's about justice. I want my grandson and his wife to understand that you can't treat people like that every action has consequences. Cohen smirked. Revenge, then. I didn't expect that from you, Finch. Not revenge, I objected. A lesson. Sometimes people have to face the consequences of their actions in order to learn to respect others. He tapped his fingers thoughtfully on the table, then nodded. All right. I'll help you with the legal side of things. I have connections in court who can expedite the case. But I need guarantees that when the house is returned to you, you will sell it to me. I'll sign a preliminary purchase agreement, I offered, with the price and terms specified. Will that be sufficient guarantee? Perhaps, Cohen nodded. What about Harris's property? Are you sure he's ready to sell? Absolutely, I confirmed. We've been neighbors for 40 years. He's been saying for a long time that he wants to move closer to his daughter in San Diego. He was just waiting for the right offer. All right, Cohen straightened up and held out his hand. It's a deal, Finch. But if you're deceiving me, I'm not deceiving you. I shook his hand, feeling a strange sense of relief. We have a common goal, Mr. Cohen. Just different motives. The next few days turned into a whirlwind of legal activity. Cohen's lawyer, Michael Stern, turned out to be a real pro. He carefully studied all the documents related to the transfer of the house and found a few more clues that Jim and I had missed. There's a whole bunch of mistakes here, he told us at a meeting in his office. Not only is there no land management deed, but there are also problems with the description of the boundaries of the plot. Incorrect classification of buildings. Who was your notary? A woman named Parker, I replied. She seemed experienced. Perhaps, Stern shrugged, but she made critical mistakes. Or, he paused. It was intentional. What do you mean? I asked, feeling a chill inside. You said your grandson's wife was rushing you to sign, he reminded me. Perhaps she knew about these mistakes and hoped you wouldn't notice them. And then, once the house was registered in their name, they could correct these mistakes without your involvement. I remembered how Peyton had insisted on closing the deal quickly, how she had distracted me with conversation while I was reviewing the documents. Was this a deliberate deception from the very beginning? In any case, Stern continued, these errors give us grounds to go to court. I have prepared a statement declaring the transaction invalid. Given Mr. Cohen's connections, we can expect expedited consideration. How soon? I asked. Under normal circumstances, it would take months, Stern replied. But in your case, I think we'll have a decision in 2 to 3 weeks. 2 days after our conversation with Stern, as I was returning to the motel after lunch at a local diner, I saw a familiar car in the parking lot. My heart skipped a beat. It was Noel's car. My grandson was sitting on the steps outside my room, hunched over and staring at the ground. When he heard my footsteps, he looked up. His face looked haggard, with dark circles under his eyes. Grandpa, he said, standing up, we need to talk. I silently opened the door to my room and let him in. He entered, looked around, and I saw a flash of guilt on his face. So this is where you live now, he said quietly. Yes, I replied, sitting down on the edge of the bed. Have a seat, Noel. He sat down on the only chair, nervously twisting the sleeve of his shirt. We received a court summons, he began without preamble. You're suing us to have the deed declared invalid. That's right, I nodded. Why? His voice sounded hurt. You wanted the house to be ours. You suggested transferring the deed to us, and you threw me out on the street, I reminded him calmly. You put my things on the lawn like trash. Old man, we don't need you anymore. Isn't that what your wife said? Noel lowered his eyes. I didn't know she would do that. I was at work when it happened. And what did you do when you found out? I asked. Did you call me? Did you come to apologize? Did you help me pack my things? He was silent, and that silence spoke louder than any words. Exactly, I said. You did nothing. You let her throw me out of the house where I'd lived for 40 years, the house where I raised you. I didn't know what to do, he whispered. Peyton said it would be better for everyone, that you wanted to live separately. And you believed that? I looked at him in disbelief. After everything that happened between us, did you really think I wanted to end up in a cheap motel with a couple of suitcases? Noel covered his face with his hands. I was confused, Grandpa. Peyton, she's persuasive. When she says something, it sounds so logical, so right. And then, when it's too late, I start to have doubts. I sighed. My grandson had always been soft, malleable, easily influenced by strong personalities. That was why Peyton had been able to manipulate him so easily. What do you want from me, Noel? I asked bluntly. Why did you come? He faltered. I want to ask you to withdraw the lawsuit. Peyton is furious. She says we'll lose the house. that will be out on the street. How? I asked quietly. He flinched as if struck. Grandpa, please. I know we did the wrong thing. I know I should have stopped her, but it's too late to change anything now. It's never too late to correct a mistake, Noel, I said. You could start by apologizing. Not to her, but to yourself, for your weakness, for letting her throw me out of my own house. The week after Noel's visit passed in tense anticipation. I stayed at a motel, occasionally calling Jim to discuss the details of our plan. Attorney Stern reported on the progress of the case. The judge was ready to consider our application on an expedited basis thanks to Cohen's connections. In the meantime, I started looking for a new place to live. I didn't want to go back to the house where the betrayal had taken place, even if the court gave it back to me. Too many painful memories, too much bitterness. I planned, as promised, to sell the house to Cohen and use the proceeds to buy a small apartment in another part of town, far away from the past. With Jim's help, I looked at several options and even found something suitable. A cozy two-bedroom apartment in an old but well-preserved building on the east side of Monterey Park. The area was quiet, with good infrastructure and, importantly, no developers buying up land for commercial projects. On Thursday, Stern called me. Mr. Finch, I have good news. The judge has reviewed our documents and is ready to issue a preliminary ruling. According to him, the evidence of legal errors in the deed is irrefutable. He is proposing that the parties meet for a pretrial settlement. What does that mean? I asked. It means that the court is giving your grandson and his wife a chance to settle the case amicably without going to a full trial, which they would almost certainly lose. If they agree to the terms you have proposed, the sale of the Redwood development house and the acknowledgement of legal errors in the deed of gift, the case will be closed. If not, the case will continue and will most likely end in your favor. When is the meeting? I asked. Tomorrow at 10 a.m. in the pretrial conference room, Stern replied. You, me, your grandson and his wife, their lawyer, a representative from Redwood, and the judge will be present. I thanked him and hung up, feeling a strange mixture of satisfaction and sadness. The plan had worked even better than I had expected, but it brought me no joy. After all, this was about my grandson, the boy I had raised. It was about how our relationship had turned into a legal battle over property. In the morning, I put on my only decent suit again and went to court. Jim drove me there, but he didn't go to the meeting. His presence wasn't required, and he preferred to stay away from official proceedings. All the participants had already gathered in the pretrial conference room. Cohen, in an impeccable dark blue suit, was talking to Stern. Noel and Peyton sat at a table next to their lawyer, whispering quietly. When I entered, Peyton gave me a look full of hatred, and Noel looked as if he hadn't slept for several days. Judge Henderson, an elderly man with an impressive gray beard, nodded to me and invited me to take a seat. When everyone was seated, he began. We are gathered here for a pre-trial settlement in the case to invalidate a real estate deed. I have reviewed the documents and must say that the plaintiff's position has serious grounds. The deed does indeed contain significant legal errors that could lead to its annulment. Peyton whispered something to her lawyer, but he just shook his head. However, the judge continued, the plaintiff is willing to withdraw the lawsuit under certain conditions. Mr. Stern, please state those conditions. Stern stood up. Your Honor, my client, Mr. Albert Finch is willing to withdraw the lawsuit under the following conditions. First, the defendants, Noel and Peyton Finch, acknowledge the existence of legal errors in the deed of gift. Second, they agree to sell the disputed property to Redwood Development for $750,000, which exceeds the market value by 20%. This is blackmail, Peyton couldn't hold back. He set this up on purpose to take our house away from us. The judge looked at her sternly. Mrs. Finch, this is no place for emotions. The facts show that there are indeed serious errors in the documents, and the offer to sell the house at above market value can hardly be called blackmail. Rather, it is an attempt to find a compromise. Noel and Peyton's lawyer whispered something to them, and Peyton reluctantly nodded. Your Honor, said the lawyer, standing up, my clients are willing to agree to sell the house to Redwood Development. However, they have a counteroffer. I'm listening, the judge nodded. They are asking that part of the proceeds from the sale of the house, specifically $100,000, be transferred to Mr. Albert Finch as compensation for moral damages and inconvenience. I was surprised by this proposal. I didn't expect Peyton to agree to give me a single cent. Apparently, their lawyer had convinced her that this would improve their position in the eyes of the court. Mr. Finch, the judge turned to me. What do you think of this proposal? I looked at Noel and Peyton. My grandson looked exhausted and depressed. Peyton remained outwardly calm, but I could see her nervously fiddling with her wedding ring, a sign of extreme tension. I agree, I said finally, provided that all the paperwork is done today. The judge nodded with satisfaction. Excellent. Then I suggest that the parties prepare the relevant documents. Mr. Cohen, as a representative of Redwood Development, are you ready to conclude the deal? More than ready, Cohen smiled. We already have a draft purchase agreement prepared. We just need to add a clause about allocating $100,000 to Mr. Finch Sr. Excellent, the judge stood up. In that case, I'm calling a 2-hour recess to prepare the documents. After that, we'll meet here to sign all the papers. When the judge left, I also got up, intending to wait for the documents to be prepared somewhere in a cafe. But before I could reach the door, Noel called out to me, Grandpa, wait, can we talk? I turned around. Noel was standing a few steps away from me, and Peyton was standing a little further away with his arms crossed over his chest. Of course, I said. I'm listening. Not here. He nodded toward the hallway. Can we go outside? We went out into the hallway and stopped by the window. Noel looked nervous, constantly adjusting his tie and avoiding my gaze. Grandpa, he finally began, we wanted to apologize to you. For everything that happened, I remained silent, waiting for him to continue. We shouldn't have treated you that way, he continued. Kicking you out of the house, throwing away your things. It was cruel and wrong. Then why did you do it? I asked calmly. Noel lowered his eyes. Peyton thought it would be better, that we needed our own space, without constant reminders of the past. Without me, you mean, I clarified. Not exactly. He shook his head. It's just, things didn't go as we planned. Peyton wanted to remodel the house, make it modern in your presence. You were always against change, Grandpa. I was against erasing our family history, I objected. The history of your childhood, your roots. But that's not the point, Noel. The point is how you handled it. Instead of talking to me, explaining your plans, you just threw me out on the street, like I was a piece of trash. I know, he looked genuinely remorseful, and I'm very sorry. Really, I made a terrible mistake, and now we're losing our home, all because of my weakness. I looked at him closely. There was pain in his eyes, but was there real guilt, or just fear of losing his property? What are you going to do now, I asked. When you sell the house? I don't know, he shrugged. Peyton wants to buy an apartment closer to the center. She says the suburbs are a thing of the past. What do you want, Noel? I asked. Not Peyton, you yourself? He looked surprised, as if the question had never occurred to him. I don't know, he repeated. Probably the same as her. We're family. We were family too, I reminded him. I raised you, Noel. I replaced the father you lost when you were 5. And look how easily you gave up on me. He lowered his head, unable to find the words. At that moment, Peyton approached us. Her face was tense, but she tried to look friendly. Albert, she began in an unnaturally soft tone, I would also like to apologize. We did a terrible thing, I understand that. And if there was a way to change everything— There isn't, I interrupted. What's done is done. But we could start over, she suggested. After we sell the house, we'll have enough money to buy something new. Maybe something with a guest house or a separate apartment for you. We could be a family again? I looked at her in bewilderment. Did she really think I could forgive and forget? That after everything that had happened, I would trust them again? Why would you want that? I asked bluntly. Why would you want me? Peyton hesitated, and I saw Noel tense up. We're family, she repeated my grandson's words. And then, that 100,000, it'll be yours anyway. We could use it together, for the common good. So that's what it was. Money. It always came down to money. They didn't want me back in their lives out of remorse or love. They wanted control over the $100,000 I was entitled to under the agreement. No, I said firmly. Thank you for the offer, but I've already found a suitable apartment, and I prefer to live on my own. But Grandpa, Noel interjected, you always said how important family is. How important it is to stick together, no matter what. That's true, I nodded. But family requires mutual respect and trust, and you destroyed both. We can fix everything, Peyton insisted. Give us a chance. I looked at them both, at the grandson I had raised and loved, and at the woman who had taken him away from me. They stood before me, feigning remorse, but I could see what was behind it. Calculation, greed, fear of losing money. No, I repeated. Some things can't be fixed. Some wounds don't heal. You made your choice. Now live with it. I turned to leave, but Peyton grabbed my arm. Please, Albert. We're really sorry. What can we do to make you believe us? Nothing, I replied, pulling my hand free. Just leave me alone. Sign the papers, take your money, and live your life. And I'll live mine. I walked away without looking back, feeling their eyes on me. My heart ached, but the decision had been made, and I knew it was the right one. Some bridges cannot be rebuilt once they have been burned. 2 hours later, we gathered again in the hall to sign the documents. Noel and Peyton looked dejected, but they signed all the papers without objection. Cohen was pleased. He was getting 2 adjacent plots of land that were perfect for his project. I also signed where required. Congratulations, Stern said to me when it was all over. You'll receive your $100,000 within 3 business days. That should be enough for a nice apartment. Thanks for your help, I thanked him. You did a great job. Just doing my job, he smiled. By the way, if you need help with the paperwork for your new property, let me know. I nodded and headed for the exit. Cohen caught up with me at the door. Finch, wait. I wanted to say that I didn't expect such persistence from you. You always seem too principled for such games. Life sometimes teaches us new tricks, I replied, even at our age. And yet, he lowered his voice, the Greenfield story. Are you really going to keep quiet? I looked him in the eye. We made a deal, Mr. Cohen. I keep my word. Always, he nodded with visible relief. I appreciate that. And if you ever need help, I'll know who to turn to. I finished for him. We shook hands and I walked out of the courthouse into the bright sunlight. Jim was waiting for me in the parking lot, leaning against his car. So, how did it go? He asked when I approached. Everything's signed, I replied. I'll get my money in 3 days. What about Noel and his wife? Jim asked, opening the car door. They tried to make up, I said, getting into the passenger seat. They offered to live together again. And what did you say? Jim started the engine. I refused, I said, staring straight ahead. Some bridges can't be rebuilt. He nodded, requiring no further explanation. We drove back to the motel, and the whole way I thought about what had happened, the decisions I had made, and the future I now had to rebuild at the age of 68. 3 days later, the promised $100,000 was deposited into my account. I immediately contacted the realtor Jim had recommended and finalized the purchase of the 2-bedroom apartment I had previously looked at. The move was quick. I had almost no belongings left after the eviction. I had to buy new furniture, dishes, and appliances. As I was choosing all this, I felt a strange sense of freedom. No attachments to the past, no sentimental items, only what I needed here and now. The new apartment gradually became a home. It was smaller than my previous home, but cozy and bright. The balcony overlooked a small park where elderly people gathered in the mornings for Tai Chi classes. Sometimes I joined them, got to know my neighbors, and made new connections. Jim often came to visit, bringing a bottle of whiskey or a pack of beer, and we would sit on the balcony, reminiscing about old times and discussing the news. He told me that Cohen had already begun preparations for construction on the site of our plot with Harris, a large shopping and entertainment complex with premium apartments. What do you think will happen to Noel and Peyton? I asked one day as we sat having dinner in my new apartment. I heard they bought a house in Pasadena, Jim replied, in one of those new neighborhoods for young professionals. I think Peyton finally got what she wanted, a prestigious address and trendy neighbors. I nodded, feeling only a faint echo of pain. Time and distance were doing their work. The wound was gradually healing, although I knew the scar would remain forever. Sometimes on particularly quiet evenings, I would take out the only surviving photograph of Ruth and talk to her, telling her about my new life, my plans, my thoughts. I knew she would be upset about my breakup with Noel, but I also knew she would understand. Ruth always valued dignity above all else. Once, about 3 months after the move, I ran into Noel at the supermarket. He was standing by the cereal aisle, thoughtfully studying the labels, and didn't notice me until I was right next to him. "Grandpa!" he exclaimed when he saw me. "I didn't know you lived nearby." "I just moved here," I replied cautiously. "How are you, Noel?" "How's the new house?" "Fine," he said, looking uncertain. "It's big and modern. Peyton is happy." "That's what matters," I nodded. An awkward pause ensued. We stood in the middle of the supermarket, two people who were once close but had become strangers to each other. "Grandpa," he finally began, "I often think about what happened, about how we treated you, and I feel so ashamed." "Noel," I interrupted him, "what's done is done. I don't hold a grudge. We just went our separate ways, and that's okay. You live your life, I live mine. But we could see each other sometimes," he suggested hopefully. "Have lunch together or just talk." I miss our conversations. I looked at my grandson, the boy I had raised, and felt a familiar pain in my heart. Part of me wanted to agree, to give him, us, another chance. But another part, the part that remembered the humiliation and betrayal, knew it was impossible. "I'm sorry, Noel," I said softly. "I'm not ready. Maybe someday, but not now." He nodded, accepting my answer. "I understand. But if you change your mind, I know where to find you," I finished for him. We said goodbye, and I continued on through the supermarket, feeling strangely light. I hadn't forgiven him. I couldn't, not now. But I realized that the anger no longer burned inside me as it had before. That was progress. When I got home, I sat on the balcony with a cup of coffee and looked out at the park below for a long time. Life went on. People came and went. Relationships were formed and broken. Material things, houses, cars, money, were acquired and lost. But in the end, the only thing that mattered was what we carried inside ourselves. Our principles, our dignity, our ability to remain true to ourselves no matter what. I didn't regret what I had done. I didn't regret refusing to reconcile with Noel and Peyton. Some actions are impossible to forgive. Some wounds are too deep to ever fully heal. And that's okay. Ruth always said that forgiveness is a gift we give ourselves first and foremost. But she also said that self-respect is just as important. And sometimes the only way to maintain that respect is to let go of those who don't appreciate it. I raised my cup, silently saluting the setting sun. A new chapter in my life was just beginning, and I was ready to write it my way, without looking back at the past and without fear of the future.